Hello, everyone. We're on day 3 of this Exodus seminar. Brought together a number of scholars from around the world and under the auspices of the production team of Daily Wire Plus. And thank you to them, and thank you once again for all of you for coming. I'll just introduce everyone. Douglas Headley, Oz Guinness, James Orr, Greg Hurwitz, a new arrival from yesterday, Dennis Prager, Stephen Blackwood, Jonathan Pajot. So we stopped yesterday at the end of Exodus 3, and I'm just going to reprise that. I was talking with Jonathan and James about the end of Exodus 3, and there's some details there. They're not details. There's some important issues that we have to pick up. So I'll just read the last 4 verses of chapter 3, and then I'll defer to Jonathan. God says to Moses, "And I have said, I will bring you up out of the affliction of Egypt," referring to the tyranny, "unto the land of the Canaanites, Hittites, Amorites, Pezerites, Hivites, and Jebusites." So land that's already occupied, which we'll get to later, "unto a land flowing with milk and honey." That's the paradisal vision for hungry people. "And they shall hearken to thy voice. And thou shalt come, thou and the elders of Israel, unto the king of Egypt, and ye shall say unto him, The Lord God of the Hebrews hath met with us. And now let us go, we beseech thee, 3 days' journey into the wilderness, that we may sacrifice to the Lord our God. And I am sure that the king of Egypt will not let you go, no, not by a mighty hand. And I will stretch out my hand and smite Egypt with all my wonders, which I will do in the midst thereof. And after that he will let you go. And I will give this people favor in the sight of the Egyptians. And it shall come to pass that when you go, you will not go empty. But every woman, it's every Jewish woman, shall borrow of her neighbor and of her that sojourneth in her house jewels of silver and jewels of gold and raiment, and ye shall put them upon your sons and upon your daughters, and ye shall spoil the Egyptians. And so over to you, Jonathan. You talked about the importance of that motif.
I think it's very important, at least to understand it narratively, because this, I think, is an answer to the big discussion we had about asking the women to kill their children. There is a sense in which the Pharaoh wants to reduce the Israelites to potential that he can rule over. And then what we see now is a kind of a flip, okay, an inversion, where in fact, Egypt will now become that which will provide potential to Israel as it leaves. And it puts things in the right order, at least narratively in the scripture, it puts it in the right order, because this is difficult for some people to understand, that Egypt is a son of Ham. Egypt is a son of the curse. He's an outsider, you would say. He's one of those that has been ejected, like Cain, ejected from the world, and acts in a way as a kind of stranger, but also potential in which we can increase ourselves. And this is where you see that actually happening. And some of the church fathers, they explicitly talk about this as being the manner in which Christians or believers can incorporate things from strange lands, that can incorporate Greek thinking, or even some poetry from other cultures or from your own ancient culture, that you can spoil the Egyptians, that it is possible to bring some things in if it's done, to bring riches in from the past and from other cultures, as long as it's done in the proper order, that it doesn't.
So would it be, in some sense, because God in this story is the Spirit that's calling the Israelites to freedom, that if you bring in the treasures in the service of the proper good, then that becomes acceptable? And then, James, over to you, because...
Well, this is really just a footnote to what Jonathan's put so beautifully just now. This motif of despoiling the Egyptians, stealing from the Egyptians, if we first see it in, I think, Origin of Alexandria, this is the just end of the 2nd century, 3rd century. Augustine uses the idea as well. He probably wasn't aware of Origin. It becomes what is actually quite a challenging verse, this sort of instruction to steal, particularly in light of the Ten Commandments coming further along. Exactly right. It's a troubling verse, but it becomes a really central idea, this claim that as Douglas was talking about yesterday, that you can, that your license to explore pagan philosophy and to take pagan ideas, to sift through these ideas, as Abrahamic monotheism was so good at drawing in Hellenic ideas without being overwhelmed by them. And we can see, even we talked about yesterday, Exodus 3:14, this very pregnant philosophical, metaphysical idea that I am that I am, God's being and his existence, his essence and his existence coming together in one. Augustine says it's obvious that Plato must have read the books of Moses when he's writing about the myth of the cave, and he's writing about objective transcendent reality and so on. And this becomes a really important idea, particularly in the second half of the first millennium. As we move into late antiquity after the collapse of Rome, you have the emergence of the monasteries, particularly under Benedict in 529 onwards, the founding of the famous monastery at Monte Cassino. And there, the idea is that, the monks preserve not just Christian scriptures and Christian texts, but also pagan ones as well. So in many ways, it's this idea that it's okay to take pagan wisdom and to preserve it and to cherish it, to nurture it, that this sort of verse licenses and justifies.
I just want to say one more thing. It's important because we might think of this as just an allegorical flurry, that this is just some kind of thing you put into the text, but we have to notice that very soon, that gold that the Egyptians have given the Israelites will be used to first make the golden calf, and then later used to make the ornaments of the tabernacle. And so you can see exactly the potential that is taken from Egypt is now shown to be either corrupting, if it's in the wrong order, to make the idols, the pagan idols, or then ultimately in service of God in order to make the ornaments of the tabernacle.
So just two quick observations on that. One of them is, I'm struck again and again by the revolutionary role of women constantly through Exodus. Like, the women keep saving the day, right? Whether it's the midwives, whether it's the Pharaoh's daughter, or here, like, why would these women be the ones who are charged with going into the households and doing it? And so,
well, one of the best predictors of economic development in the developing world is the freedom and rights associated with women. And there's a mythological similarity between women and the foreign in some sense. And so what you might say is that to the degree that a society is capable of, the patriarchs in a society are capable of attending to and valuing their own women who are other, they're capable of valuing the other as such.
And it speaks to security, right? To the lack of need to control women speaks to masculine security is one aspect. But the other thing that struck me is that the empathy here, because empathy is an argument let's say it's ascendant in certain ways in the contemporary culture that might feel like in ways that are slightly corrupted, but empathy used to true end can lead to change in evolution and revolutionary thinking and revolution. And that comes in through them. And the strength of the women here is really remarkable because they do a whole bunch of things for no reason that kind of makes any sense politically, based on the basis of that, like the great feminine power. The other thing I was going to say about the gold, you're talking about, Jonathan, the ways that the gold is appropriated. Nobody ever says where they get their weapons when they finally have the weapons. And so it's like, I think that it's either two options if I'm looking at this as a thriller writer. I mean, one of it is that this gold and silver is forged into weapons that is taken from here. Or maybe they pulled it off the washed up bodies of the Egyptians, right? But there's
it's the same idea,
right? So either way, it's appropriated, right? It's forged into not just the messaging and the tabernacle of God, but also the forcefulness has to come in some ways from materials from the Egyptians.
There's another side of this, I think, is let's call it psychological. In a certain sense, I think what these first 3 chapters have done for us is really sort of set out the whole drama of the human soul, like the whole drama of the spiritual life. And you start in oppression and alienation, unable to get out of it yourself, longing for resolution, for homecoming, for the promised land, and you can't get there. And so in a way, I think the story, this Exodus is, of course, precisely about God's work in moving us from exile and from oppression to homecoming and resolution and nourishment. But I think there's a side to this that is present in the spoiling of the Egyptians that's also psychological, and that is within that drama of redemption, or let's say, or salvation, there's, it's not like salvation could be real, true salvation if we forgot about everything we were before. And, if somehow our sins and our sufferings, our toils and tribulations that define us as like this day to day, who I am and have been. And we all carry these things with us. Certainly I am today and any day. If those are somehow not part of where you end up in your resolution, then it's not you that is saved. And so there's a sense in which I think this is, at least metaphorically, the jewels of the Egyptians are a way of saying that this time of oppression and slavery will yet be turned into the promised land in a sense.
Well, that's particularly relevant when you're trying to deal with something like the atrocious tyranny of the past. It's like, well, even if it's Egypt, and Egypt is also obviously cast as the tyrannical oppressor here, that doesn't mean there isn't the gold that you could use to build the proper tabernacle, and there are also the proper weapons that can still be derived from it, even if it's painted as the tyranny itself. So,
may I just make one concluding remark about this fascinating motif of spoiling the Egyptians, and that is in relation to the notion of Eurocentrism, which, of course, we hear a lot about, and many critiques of Eurocentrism. And yet, one of the striking aspects of European, let's say, Occidental culture, I'm thinking of North American culture as part of that Occidental world, of course, is, as a French philosopher recently has noted, is that it is eccentric. So this is a philosopher called Remy Brague. And Remy Brague has very powerfully argued that because our ancestors in Europe for centuries were using Latin, but Latin as a translation for sources either at the fringe of Europe, Greece, or outside Europe, Hebrew. So that European culture was based on the sense that even though as a monk in Monte Cassino or elsewhere, you might be using Latin, that the Latin is a translation, and it's a translation of the Greek, or it's a translation of the Hebrew. And he argues this is one reason why medievals took up Arabic so quickly, because once it became clear that Arabic was a way of actually getting to Greek more accurately, that was greeted with enthusiasm. So Brague's idea is that, unlike, say, the Indic tradition, where the Samskrita, the Sanskrit, is the elegant tongue, that is the holy language, or even in Arabic, where, because of course that's the language of the Prophet, European culture and European Western culture is based on this idea that its sources are without. So that the very idea of an ethnocentric Occidental culture is a very problematic notion. And I think here this notion of the espousing the spoiling of the Egyptian, the taking of the foreign and using it in a positive way, I think is very significant.
We could extend that too, to some degree, to the scientific endeavor. One of the things you commented on before we recorded today, James, was the fact that there's an insistence that God is a transcendent unity and not merely something that's tribal, and that is lurking in some sense everywhere. And so that would be in the stranger and the foreigner, but it also means that God is in some real sense lurking in the material world and the natural object. And so just as you can look outside your culture for the treasure that the stranger and the foreigner might possess, you can look outside your own material presuppositions for the transcendent knowledge that the natural world would hold. And that's actually, there's a historical tradition that Christianity and the scientific endeavor were at each other's throats, but it's a preposterous notion if you look into it more deeply. Underneath all that is the insistence that it's meet and good to encounter the natural world and to investigate it because it contains revelations as well.
There's a reason Jung spent the second half of his career on alchemy, right? Or was it his whole second half?
Pretty much.
And what's the phrase? I always forget the phrase that means the thing of greatest value.
Insterquilinis inventur.
Yes.
What you most need will be found where you least want to look.
That's right.
Right. Which is, well, that's a phrase you can think about that in relationship to the crucifixion too, if you regard it as the in some senses, the symbol of the ultimate union of tragedy and malevolence. It's exactly there is the least place you want to look. And it's the dragon that contains the gold, or maybe the tyrant that contains the treasure as well. Same idea. That's like overcoming a giant, too. Or the very common mythological
the gold
motif.
and resources of the Egyptian slave holders.
Mm-hmm. Yes, exactly that.
Well,
exactly.
One of the early criticisms of monotheism, in certainly by pagan philosophers, was that monotheism secularizes nature. That is to say, it rids nature of gods, of magic. If you've got a creationist framework, that is to say, you've got a framework in which all of reality is understood to be the outcome of a single, purposive, supremely rational, all-powerful being, then you don't need to explain earthquakes by appealing to Poseidon. There aren't going to be any more sort of nymphs in the forests, as it were. All of that gets banished. This is a sort of common criticism. Mm-hmm. And certainly I think it's true that it also brings with it this idea that nature is legible. That is to say, all of nature is legible.
Right. Not animated, but legible. Because it de-animates it, too, if you take God out of the equation, right?
It reflects the kind of a single creative blueprint of a single source of a single kind of cognitive source of subjectivity, a unified consciousness. I mean, in Plato's heaven, you've got all of these different things existing. You've got numbers, you've got propositions, you've got truths and forms and all this sort of thing. What Philo of Alexandria does in the 1st century, and what Augustine does later in the 4th century, is to, as it were, give a kind of change of metaphysical address, where he says we've got to sort of baptize Plato's heaven. We've got to move all of this, everything that's in Plato's heaven into the divine mind. And that's a much more natural philosophical home for thoughts and propositions and numbers and so on and so forth.
Let me offer a word on the spoiling of the Egyptians, which I don't think you would have necessarily considered without the Hebrew. The Hebrew note, most of your translations say borrow. Is that correct? The King James and some others.
It's funny.
So first of all, notice it doesn't say take. It really doesn't say borrow either, and this will fascinate you. The Hebrew is you will ask. I mean, and it's in modern Hebrew as well. This is not a difficult word. Sha'alta, she'ela, it means question, to ask. Number two, in light of your point about the women, I think that adds to the point that I'm making. It's much less intimidating to have the women get the jewelry than the men. So in effect, what is happening is, so the women will ask for valuables is not the same as men will take. Mm-hmm. So I just wanted to note that because I think it's relevant to what the text wants to say.
Isn't there another point, Dennis, too, that the rabbis say that later when indentured servants are freed, the master gives them something as they go out.
That's right.
And this is the Lord's doing it for his people as they leave slavery.
And by the way, on your point about desacralizing nature, all of the plagues except for the 10th are against nature gods of Egypt.
Mm-hmm. Oh, okay, good. Okay, well, we'll definitely get to that. Okay, so we've hit Exodus 4:1. And Moses answered and said, "But, behold, they will not believe me, nor hearken unto my voice. For they will say, The Lord hath not appeared unto thee. And the Lord said unto him, What is that in thine hand? And he said, A rod, a staff, a walking stick, a pole. And he said, Cast it on the ground. And Moses cast it on the ground, and it became a serpent. And Moses fled from before it. And the Lord said unto Moses, Put forth thine hand, and take it by the tail. And Moses put forth his hand and caught it, and it once again became a rod in his hand. Well, there's a lot packed into that, that's for sure. I'll just make a couple of comments and then it'll open up. The staff of Moses and the staff of Aaron, that idea just never goes away after this introduction in the text. And so a staff is something, if you have a staff and you're the owner of a company, the staff does your will, that you rely on the staff as well. And that meaning is a derivation from this same root idea. If you're walking, when you walk with a walking stick, then you can lean on the stick. And so while you're on the way, you have something to lean on. And so the rod is also a symbol of solidity and stability and tradition. And then the rod, the staff, the tradition can turn into a snake. And that means that what's solid and reliable and that you can use on your way can also transform itself suddenly into chaos. So there's yin-yang dichotomy there that emerges. And then after all that, and that's terrifying because when your tradition falls apart and the chaotic serpents emerge instead, then that's terrifying. And that's what happens to Moses. But then God tells him, take the serpent by the tail, which, by the way, is the most dangerous way to grab a serpent because you grab them by the head. And so if you have enough courage to grasp what's dangerous, then you will become credible enough to be listened to. And that's part of the understructure narrative that drives this, in some sense, this magic trick. And then we see the motif of being exposed to the serpent as a curative process replicated through itself through the text. And we also know that the symbol that even modern physicians use to symbolize their healing power is the symbol of the rod and the staff, which I believe in that case is of Greek origin.
Asclepius, yeah.
Right, Asclepius. But there's a parallel there that's
there's
obviously
definitely
not.
A parallel.
Well, and is that historical replication? Is it archetypal replication?
I think it's archetypal.
Is it derivation from the same source?
Has to be archetypal. We'll see it more when we get to the serpent on the staff itself. That story we can maybe talk about it then, but it's definitely a universal story. But it's also referring to the serpent and the tree. You know, in terms of
It's interesting because for Moses, as we're thinking about him as the emergent hero, and we were talking yesterday a lot about the fact that his ability to engage transformationally is one of the things that's defining. His ability to see and hear God is what illuminates God to him, though God's already independent in Genesis, as we discussed. But the ability to transform the snake, right, into a staff again is the transformational ability that means it's caused to lead, right? That's
the definition
chaos.
of the hero. The hero does
Right.
both. He casts order into chaos and chaos into order. He's a mediating factor between the two.
That's right. So I always think with the yin and yang, people forget the eyeballs. And the eyeballs for me are like Colossus of Rhodes astride the line. That's where you want to stand. And so it's good from evil per the tree, the Garden of Eden, but it's also chaos to order.
Yeah, I think chaos to order is actually a better way to understand it. It's the rod to that which is flexible, right? A snake is that's why it also says grab by the tail. It's making you want to understand that it's a tail. It's something that moves and is flexible, isn't solid like a staff. But you can understand it in terms of attention because that's actually how attention works. It's like you have something undefined. What do? You mentally or physically grasp it, and when
that isn't what understand means.
That's exactly.
And Piaget pointed that out when he talked about children building their what do you call those psychomotor schema to begin with. So the basic preconceptions of perception itself are the gripping element. And so when children are trying to figure out how to see something and therefore how to conceptualize and perceive it, that's why people say sometimes look with your eyes and not with your hands, right? They'll say that to their little kids, but their little kids are literally gripping the chaos of the world so that they can transform it into something stable and reliable. So
it's worth making the obvious point that, you know, both the rod and the snake are symbols of sovereign pharaonic authority. The pharaohs would have had a snake in their headdress. I think
even more than that, not only the snake, but the pharaohs have a rod and a fly swat. And so the fly swat is also that tail. And so it is a rod and a tail.
So the symbolism is that Moses is being invested with a kind of counter authority, he's becoming the leader of anti-Egypt.
Right. So you have to be the master of the staff and the snake in order to lead.
Well, and that's the snake that eats all the other snakes.
Right. So that's a representation of his ability to. So that's so interesting that it's the snake, right? So he's the master of the chaos that eats all other chaos.
Yeah,
or
but
is it matter the possibility that swallows all other possibilities?
It's the rod that eats the snakes. When we get to it, you'll see. We think that it's the snakes, but in my memory, it says that Moses' rod ate the snakes of the
It's Moses'
Yeah,
rod.
because that's how it works, right? It's the order that actually that contains. It's actually like grasping the tail. The rod is going to consume the.
So it's
the
a
snake.
superordinate order that can consume all chaos.
Yeah.
And that's what Moses is standing for.
He has
and
the
that's why
best-
he's an agent of the highest authority.
But you can see it as the law itself. Like it's the law and the transgressions. And so it's like one moves. He's able to master, like you said, grab it and it comes back.
Yeah, and it's also the shepherd's staff, I guess. The sort of imagery of him becoming the shepherd of his people, and so the rod becomes the shepherd's crook.
Chasing away the shepherds, even
Absolutely, yeah, that's right. And defeating the Pharaoh.
What does a
symbolically, the
shepherd
snake.
use a rod for?
Well, I mean, a shepherd's crook, I guess,
Yeah.
a staff.
Right, and
well,
it's to rein in the sheep. Is that also part of it?
That's
and
right.
to fight off lions.
To rescue
I presume?
the sheep. To rescue the
To
sheep.
rescue the sheep.
To lead the sheep, to round them up.
Yeah. Well, we should remember that when you were a shepherd in that time, that was actually a real man's job because there were lions and they liked to eat sheep. And so part of being a shepherd was like fighting off lions. And so,
Are you implying that contemporary shepherds aren't sufficiently
No,
manly?
I wouldn't dare to do
Because
that.
we have some contemporary shepherds we can have a conversation with you, Doctor.
By the way, the order chaos thing is so, I'm glad you raised it, and I had not thought of it, frankly, in these terms. But it's for me the central teaching of Genesis. I always tell people I think Genesis 1:1 is the most important verse in the Bible, but I think 1:2 is the second most important. Everything was chaos, and what God does for 6 days is make order out of chaos. So and we are living in the post-God era, and we are living in a chaotic era. And I hope I'm not too contemporary by noting that men menstruate is a statement of chaos.
Right.
So again, the centrality of the significance of God.
Well, that's an anti-rod movement because Derrida himself said that his deconstructionism was aimed at phallocentricism. It was phallogocentricism, but that degeneration of those categories, especially with regard to male and female, that's not an accidental consequence
not at
of the
all.
system of ideas. That's a central target of
That's
what we
right.
use called
And
focal attack. And it is an attack on the rod, fundamentally. So...
No, I just, forgive me, I just want to make one other macro point, because that's how my mind thinks. In my many decades of radio and speaking and so on, I have not made as much as I believe in God, I truly do, I have never found that arguments for God's existence are nearly as effective or as important as arguments for God's necessity. Mm-hmm. And that's the point that I want to make here, and we're all making here. No God, chaos. You don't believe in God, at least understand what the consequences of that non-belief are.
What's interesting?
Go ahead, Greg.
What's interesting about that is we keep having these and the more that I've been thinking about this in relation to my, forays into the political or cultural world, this is another consequence of how you align the moral with the strategic. And in some ways, what you're saying is if you make a moral argument, people don't even know why they think what they think. So to come in and say to them, you need to change your moral outlook, right? What you're suggesting is, and why I think that's more fruitful, is it's a strategic approach. And that's a way to lead people in, and then they can decide how high up that hierarchy of understanding they want to move.
Well, you can look at this purely psychologically, which I like to do as much as possible, because I don't think you should bring God into the issue unless you have to, in some sense. You either are aiming for something unified, which means something at the pinnacle and something that's the highest and superordinate and most valuable, or you're not, in which case perhaps you're aiming down, or you're aiming at a multiplicity of diverse things which are conflictual. Those are your options. And we know that if your perception is fragmented and if your navigation is fragmented, which is a chaotic state, the consequence of that is anxiety and despair, because that's actually what anxiety and despair mark, is that you're confident and secure when you've reduced your plethora of potential pathways forward to one path. You know that if you're in a vehicle, it's like, well, Are you going one place or 10? If you're going 10, you can't go anywhere and you're confused. You have to be going one place. And then everything snaps together and then your nervous system is literally regulated. Anxiety is the response to chaos, the a priori response to chaos.
Can I ask Dennis a question in light of that? So, Dennis, you said earlier that the necessity of God is the necessity of belief in God is what's going to restore us, what's going to keep civilization on the right track. But is it enough to have a kind of psychological, just a psychological sort of stability, a belief that God might exist, or that you should conduct yourself as if God is real, God exists, just as a kind of something that provides you with a kind of psychological unity and stability and order? Or do you think that that a culture needs more than that? Is a kind of cultural religion, cultural Judaism, cultural Christianity enough?
Well, mine's not cultural. I'm not as nice as cultural is.
But you seem to leave open that possibility.
Yes, I wrestle with that, and I have come down I've come to the conclusion that I offered earlier. The number of people who believe in God and that God is meaningless is enormous. For most moderns, God is a celestial butler. This God, here is my list of what I'd like you to do for me. Have a great day. I am uninterested. I know this is almost heretical for many of my religious friends. I have asked God in my whole life twice for something. Once that my mother not punish me for breaking the vase in the house, and then once as an adult. By the way, in both instances, they were answered. It's a little eerie for me, who doesn't ask him for anything. But in all seriousness, I am infinitely more interested in what God wants from me than what I want from God. And that's the way I portray it to people. And they're moved by that, because they know God is not a celestial butler. The number of people who prayed for their dying child and the child died, everybody knows that that's the case. So I hate to use the term, I was going to say tired. Okay, I'm tired of people who say they believe in God, but it doesn't amount to anything. Why is God important? Changes minds. That, and you know, the founders of America, which I think is the greatest country ever founded, and it may fall over. We're at a crisis point. They knew the importance. They were not all doctrinaire Christians. They were all, by the way, cultural Christians, clearly. But they were all very God-centered. When Benjamin Franklin is considered a deist, if deist means Aristotle's unmoved mover, none of the founders were deists. They believed in a God who acted in history. Jefferson, this is almost unknown to Americans. Jefferson and Franklin designed a Great Seal of the United States. You'll find this fascinating. You know what it is? The Jews leaving Egypt. It was not, tragically, it was not adopted. Two of the least Orthodox Christians, small o, wanted a biblical depiction to depict America. The Hebrews left Egypt, we left Europe. So they knew the importance of God, and a lot of believers don't. And so I'm sorry for talking so long, but
John, can I pick up on what Dennis is saying? Another aspect of the American Revolution. You probably know that at the defeat at Yorktown, the Hessian and British troops were ordered to play the ballad, "The World Turned Upside Down," which was a 17th century ballad and came out of the English Revolution, which came out of the Torah. And the simple idea was, it became various crazy things with the diggers and the levelers and so on. God had created order. Humans had created disorder. So God, to create order again, turned the world the right way up and turned it upside down. And you have in Acts 17, these men who've turned the world upside down have come here. And so on. And the original idea of revolution was actually biblical, although today it's almost totally taken over by the left. reordering the world and putting it the right way up. Or again, you should say repairing.
That's a revolution.
Repairing the earth.
Yes,
Cocoon.
repairing the world under the rule of God, yeah.
So we could say that you could ask the question not so much what do you have with God, you could reverse it in the Nietzschean sense. You could say, what do you have without God? Mm-hmm. And then what you definitely have is you have no centralizing axis, you have no highest spirit in the highest place. And so psychologically, that means chaos and confusion and internal conflict. And then you have no common spirit that unites you. And so then you have conflict. And so I would say that acting as if is the crucial issue. And I was going over that this morning in a class I was doing on the Sermon on the Mount. And Christ says in the Sermon on the Mount, the ordering of his ethical injunction is something like, do and then teach. But it's in that order. But it's not do only, and it's not teach only. It's do and then teach. And so you could say you have this internal mimicry of the Father, the Holy Spirit, let's say, the revolutionary spirit in the proper sense. And then you can communicate descriptions of that spirit. And that's the religious enterprise. And we confuse that, I would say, in some sense, with descriptions of external reality. They're not the same thing. The religious enterprise is the description of the animating spirit and the proper animating spirit. And that's why even in the Exodus story, God is presented as the spirit that calls the hero to lead his people out of slavery. It's not a description of the world. It isn't that the idea that there's wisdom in the world isn't there, but that's not the superordinate idea. And so I think you need both. You have to have the acting as if. That's the primary thing, because otherwise you're a hypocrite.
The most famous philosopher of the as if is Immanuel Kant of the 18th century. I mean, just the great kind of father of the Enlightenment. And he's often thought to be somebody who does away with God. He's a kind of precursor to Nietzsche in lots of ways. There was a poet called Heine who said that Kant was much more devastating than Robespierre, because whereas Robespierre just decapitated a king, Kant decapitated God. But I think he had this idea that we can't know that God exists. We can't have theoretical knowledge that God exists, but we must so conduct ourselves in the ethical life as if God exists.
Because as free beings, that's the primacy of pure practical reason. So we know its reality as free agents. So you could say in a way that Kant is not actually claiming that, I mean, I think Heine's completely wrong about this, but that it's, God is just a regulative as if, as of, but rather he is criticizing a notion that, a sort of Aristotelian, Platonic notion, that we can know God by contemplating some abstract object. And he's saying, no, we have contact. We have contact with noumenal reality. Right. We have contact with the divine as free agent. So when we obey the categorical imperative, which he thinks is intrinsically linked to the idea of God, that's the kind of knowledge.
We saw that echoed with Moses. I mean, Moses walks by the burning bush, but as we all noted, he does turn to notice. And so I would say we do have access to experience of God if we pay enough attention. And we pay enough attention to the things that, in some sense, transcend our current parochial conceptualizations.
I mean, I think you're quite Kantian in, I think, your approach, Jordan, in the sense that you attend to the structures of subjectivity and the structures of that are uncovered by psychoanalysis and psychology. But you're also, I think, more, and this is a development, I think. I've not really heard you talk like this until quite recently. This notion of transcendence, not kind of divine transcendence, but somehow that the world beyond, the world as it's given, morality as well, pierces through that kind of your kind of psychological wrapping. I think that's a development in your thought. Just going back to Jonathan's point, there is this, what Kant is doing and what maybe you're doing as well, Jordan, is separating out what you can say about God. So you're just, Kant says we put God behind what we can really know, but we can still have faith in God. We can conduct ourselves as if God exists, but we can't know that God exists. So.
I want to return to Dennis's point. I think it's such an important point. And first of all, with your track record on what you've asked God, I think you would get a little bit more confident in future requests.
Well, actually, I think I got the requests as God's way of laughing at me.
Yeah.
So you never asked me for anything? Just for that, I will deliver.
Right. And also, you really want to burn one of your genie wishes on a vase?
All right. I was 8 years old. All right. Hello. Okay.
But the point you made that I think is so important is you talked about that you basically, your relationship with God is asking for responsibility. Like, what is your responsibility? What does God want you to do?
Right.
And that, to me, is the solution.
A better prayer.
Sorry?
That's a better prayer.
It's a better prayer, but it's also the solution to when you're saying you're in a car and you need to know where you're going, right? You and I talk all the time about how right now we have an elevation of what people's rights are over what their responsibilities are, right? If you're asking God for things, it's infinite what you might want. And thank God for unanswered prayers. There's a reason why that is a cliche that has entered not only the vernacular, but country music. Right. And so part of this is it's infinite if you're dictating your relationship with God based on things you might want. But with responsibility, if you're focused to ask what it is and how you should serve, that's what puts you in a car in a particular direction.
Maybe that's also what helps you know that God exists in some real sense. I mean, there's a paradox in the notion of whether we can know God exists. And the paradox is in part, you can't know God. And so can you know that something exists that you can't understand? And the answer is, well, maybe that's why you only see God's back in some real sense, right? You get hints, and maybe you get hints if you open yourself up in the right way. And one of the ways you open yourself up in the right way is not to ask for what you want in the God is a celestial butler manner, but to ask how it is that you could transform yourself so that you could be a better agent of the divine will or something like that.
And then what do you find when you do that? When you embrace responsibility, what you find is meaning.
Yeah, well, that seems to be the case.
Well, especially if the responsibility you believe is divine.
Right.
If it's just purely human, I don't know how much meaning it gives.
Well, probably.
But what I mean is in your approach.
Yeah, that is my approach.
So that is a route to meaning, which is a route to the divine.
Well, the secularists would say, well, without God, you could still find meaning in service to others. And I would say, yes, that's true. But the reason you find meaning in the service to others is because that's one step on the ladder to the divine.
Yeah. Well, the people who constructed the gulags, there was a lot of altruism there. There was a lot of cooperation. There was a lot of, there was a horizon of action, and there was planning and so on.
By the way, forgive me, I just want to say the issue of the consequences of no God is a very powerful impetus in my life to belief. As odd as it sounds, I always tell people I come to God through the back door, not through the front door. The front door is God has appeared to you in some way or whatever, and I never knock that for anyone who has that experience. I have not. To me, the most powerful rational argument is the consequences of the death of the divine. When the chaos and indeed ultimately evil that ensues, if I understand that without X, nothing exists, then X must exist. I'm not a physicist. I don't think in the algebraic terms, but that's how I think. The greatest argument for God is what happens without God.
It seems to be, in some sense, the most irrefutable argument. I would say came to my belief the same way. It's like, well, Nietzsche said God is dead, and what's going to happen? His prognostication was, nihilism and psychological catastrophe, and then mass murder on a scale unparalleled, which was exactly right.
But Nietzsche would just call this wish fulfillment. He might say, well, maybe reality just doesn't like us very much.
It doesn't.
But also Exodus would have an answer to that. Like the view I think that this text is offering to us is there's nothing outside of God. I mean, there is no, is there God, is there not God? I mean, at least the account of this text, if we can take it seriously, this text here is that it's all within God. There's no outside here.
That's part of the divine unity and the divine unity argument.
And in a sense, I think what's at least what the text is saying, I think, is that this text is trying to help us have a revelation of what God is. That's what the Bible takes itself to be doing. And in this case, the statement that God is this transcendent principle, the source of all being, the origin and, you might say, sovereign principle of all reality, I think is very fundamental here in relation to, we can't simply say Moses goes and he does these things. I mean, the whole language of the text here, and I think the whole argument of Exodus, is that Moses has to bring himself into conformity with that transcendent principle, which is his source. And it's always described as, he says right here in the beginning of the fourth chapter, they're not going to believe me. And he says, well, okay, let me tell you what to do. And it says this comes again and again and again. And God said to Moses, here's what I want you to do.
So
There's
if you
no
abide
sense
by God's word, then people will assume that you're a legitimate agent of God.
And part of that, to James's point about the gulags, which is a very fair point, is we tend to think of this orientation